Welcome back to Close Up and our extended interview with Governor Chris Sununu. Thanks for joining us again, Governor. And let's hop right back into the questions, starting with your party. Do you believe former President Trump is still the leader of the GOP?
I don't think any individual is ever the leader of a political party. I don't think Donald Trump is the only representative of the Republican Party. I don't think Bernie Sanders is the only representative of the Democrat Party. A political party is really about your philosophies, your ideals, what's important to you in terms of what you want to see in your community, and subsequently how you tend to vote. But here in New Hampshire, everyone, lots of folks jump around the ticket. So no, it's not about a leader of the party. Am I the leader of the Republican Party in New Hampshire? No, I'm not. There's lots of folks that have representative leadership in their communities and across the board. So no, I've never subscribed to that type of mentality.
The impeachment trial is wrapping up in the Senate. You've said that Trump's rhetoric contributed to the insurrection at the Capitol. Did the events of January 6th and all that violence that we saw there in Washington make you reconsider at all your status, self-declared status as a, quote, Trump guy through and through?
No, well, look, what happened on January 6th was horrible, and I was very clear that his words definitely contributed to really inflaming the situation, to be sure. So I think it was disappointing. I think a lot of folks who, were disappointed when the president was going after the vice president, he was going after, Governor Kemp and all his former allies. I think, what we saw there was, I think only the president, former President Trump can explain those words and those actions at the end of the day. But it really was a terrible point in the country's history, and something that I hope we don't just forget, that we learn from, right? That words have actions, that as leaders, as representatives, we should be held to a higher standard of leadership in terms of our words and what they mean. Leadership isn't just about what you propose on policy or a budget or a piece of paper. It's how you conduct yourself. It's about inspiring folks to hopefully better themselves, because as a Republican, I believe in local control and individual responsibility. So therefore, it isn't just about one person. It's about those individuals. You just asked about the Republican Party. Republican Party is defined not by its leadership, but by those that support us, by those individuals. I know Democrats tend to be more big government, single leadership at the top, but we're really defined by those individuals, and I just adhere to that. So at the end of the day, I still have a huge responsibility about our actions, our words, our tone, and our rhetoric, and I just think that elected officials have to be held to a higher standard.
You recently said you'll be making a decision on whether or not you'll run for the U.S. Senate sometime by early summer, the end of the spring. You're over 70% approval rating here in New Hampshire. You have a growing political brand, which is rare in these partisan times. So why hand off that brand to Mitch McConnell and join the partisan trench warfare of Washington? It's like you've got a great tech startup and you're exploring the idea of selling to Radio Shack.
I think that's a great analogy, actually. Look, I haven't thought about running. Everyone is talking about it, I know, but I really have not thought about running for Senate right now. We got so much to do. I mean, my day is absolutely filled. It really is. Whether it's vaccination, still making sure we have testing, making sure we're bringing PPE, try to get schools open, managing a budget, seeing what is going on in Washington, make sure that we can be responsive. I got, a lawsuit that I'm trying to win with the state of Massachusetts, so they stop taxing our citizens here. So I got enough on my plate. At some point, as we get through the legislative session, maybe 6-7 months from now, I know that I'll have to figure all that out, because if I run or don't run or whatever, I just do appreciate that folks are waiting to see what I do. And I don't want to leave people in limbo. There's other great candidates out there if other folks want to run. I'm just way far away from that, but I'll take a look. But yes, if you're comparing Congress in Washington to New Hampshire, I think the Radio Shack analogy is a pretty good one.
Oh, there is one Radio Shack, I think, still in Hillsborough. It's a great store. We love it. But there is an interesting parallel here. Your family is obviously a top consideration. You're in the unique position of having gone to Washington before, if I'm correct, right? When your dad became chief of staff, you went with the family down to D.C. And if I recall correctly, you didn't really exactly enjoy your experience there. Does that factor into your decision?
Who does enjoy their experience in Washington? No, of course it does. I was down there. I was in high school at the time, and I was, those were my high school age years, just for a few years there. And no, it wasn't a great place. And my sense is it's even worse now. It's tough. Obviously, look, you want good leadership. You don't just give. I criticize Washington a lot. It doesn't mean I give up on it. I don't think any of us should give up on it. We always want to strive to make it better and hopefully inspire good folks to step up. I think we have a lot of folks in New Hampshire that could step up and run for the U.S. Senate, and maybe should. But again, I'm not thinking about that so much. It would be a tough haul to be down in Washington. It's not my ideal. I'm a manager. I like to create. I like to innovate. And if there's a way to bring that to D.C., maybe that's something to consider. But it's just not what I'm thinking about. We just have so much to do here. And I think we're doing it really well, frankly. I'm having a lot of fun.
Let's get to some issues under the virtual Golden Dome. Education savings accounts could finally pass. I'm wondering why in that bill there has to be a separate business entity that manages those education savings accounts. These are taxpayer dollars. Why can't the state handle the administration of education savings account rather than have a third party skimming money off the top?
Well, I think it could. Again, I didn't write the bill. I know that the legislature is debating it right now. There's a lot of opportunities. I think that bill will change probably a few different times before it potentially even gets to my desk or a final vote in the legislature. But I think that is definitely an option. I think there's a lot of different things that have to be considered there. Philosophically, I think it's a great idea. But again, you have to make sure it can be operationalized. A lot of times, great ideas on paper don't amount to much if you can't really make it something tangible for the citizens. And again, whether the state were to manage that process or a private entity, a couple different options there, but I think everything needs to be on the table.
New Hampshire had record turnout in November, and a big part of that was the no-fault absentee voting that was in place due to the pandemic. Even though Republicans clearly reaped the benefits of that absentee voting, winning back the House, the Senate, and the Executive Council, some Republicans have filed bills not just to go back to the way it was, but also to make it harder to set up obstacles to absentee voting, such as having to photocopy your ID and send that in with your ballot. Is that something you would sign if it reaches your desk?
Well, I'd say this. We've always had very high voter turnout, some of the highest voter turnout in the country year after year. Clearly, the absentee voting was an issue here because of COVID, and we just allowed for that flexibility. It worked very well. But the vast majority of folks want to go in and will still be going into their town halls or their schools to cast their vote. And again, I haven't looked at that piece of legislation in particular. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of pieces of legislation that will never even come to my desk. They'll probably even die in committee. So I haven't seen that piece at all. But anything that were to get to my desk, we just look at them individually and look at all, I am allowed some time to make sure I look at the pros and the cons and the testimony and all that. I haven't looked at that piece individually, but we've always had a great voter turnout in New Hampshire, and I suspect that'll continue regardless of where we go in the future. People want to be part of the process.
If this is a hockey team, you definitely have a couple of defensemen by the name of Morse and Bradley who might stop a few of those things from getting to you. Do you want to get to the bottom of that very strange thing that happened in Windham with the voting machines? I know some conspiracy theory folks are really frothing at the mouth about what happened with these 300 votes that switched between Republican candidates. Shouldn't the Attorney General be taking a look at exactly what happened just to get the truth?
Yes, and they are. I know the Attorney General is looking at that. I don't have any further information other than I know they're looking at it. It was really weird, and it was 300 votes that the machine said one thing, the hand count said something, not just the opposite, but very, very different. So I'm not sure what the answer is there. I know they're looking at it, but I'll tell you this. If in our entire system, out of 1.35 million people, if we're looking at one issue of 300 votes, I'm not minimizing that. You have to get to the bottom of it. But without a doubt, our system worked really, really well here in New Hampshire, especially compared to some of these other states. So we have to get to the bottom of this one issue. It could be one machine. Who knows? I don't know what the issue is, and they're going to look at that. But we did really, really well, and people shouldn't worry about our system. If anything, our system in New Hampshire is looked at a model for the rest of the country. So you got to, the beauty is that we have a system that can get granular and worry about the last 300 votes, whereas, some states are worrying about 300,000. We're worrying about 300. So you don't want to minimize that. We'll look into it, but overall, our system works very, very well, and it has a lot of integrity.
I want to get one quick question in here. Last November when we had you on, we talked about redistricting. You said you hadn't heard about anyone wanting to redraw the map dramatically. Now the NHGOP chairman is saying potentially there's going to be a guarantee for a Republican congressman in 2022. So are you looking at, or will you sign a dramatically redrawn map for New Hampshire, particularly for CD1? No. I mean, the answer is I don't suspect we're going to have a radically redrawn map. We don't have massive gerrymandering. I know we have that funky Executive Council District 2, and I hope they fix that. That's the only real example I can think of where there was a real weird district drawn out of the over 420 different districts that are drawn in the state. We just don't have massive amounts of gerrymandering or anything like that. I don't suspect, I haven't seen the demographics, but I don't suspect that the districts will be drawn a whole lot differently. But I would just say we should never
guarantee. I appreciate the head of the Republican GOP saying we're definitely going to have a Republican winner in 22. But this is New Hampshire, and so great candidates can come from both sides of the aisle. And obviously, I'd like to see Republicans finally win some of those federal seats. But at the end of the day, it's really about the candidates stepping up and being good voices for their communities. And I think a good candidate, regardless of party, can win anywhere. So I don't think it's a redistricting issue as much as it is just finding good candidates that care about their communities and want to do the best for them.
All right, Governor Chris Sununu, thanks so much for joining us on Close Up.